Hello everybody! In this video, I would like to talk about the relationship between democracy and individual sovereignty. A lot of people, right-wing libertarians in particular, often speak negatively about democracy and warn of the tyranny of the majority. This meme right here encapsulates their sentiment quite well. So what if everyone votes to take your bike? What if they vote to make you a slave? Is that democratic? Democracy, they say, is nothing more than mob rule. While democracy may have its benefits, it needs to be counterbalanced by a strong, undemocratic constitution which shields minorities from the ravages of mob rule. Even left-wing commentators who speak positively of democracy seem to buy into this framing of democracy as being fundamentally reducible to majority rule and something that is at odds with, and which needs to be balanced against, the sovereignty of the individual. This framing is so common that even some dictionaries contain definitions that describe democracy as simply just majority rule. So our central question is this: is democracy at odds with the sovereignty of the individual? In this video, I will argue instead that democracy is grounded in individual sovereignty, and further that democracy promotes individual sovereignty far better than any other form of government. I will do so building on ideas from John Stuart Mill as well as the ideas of Friedrich August von Hayek and John Rawls as presented by Viktor Vanberg in his 2008 paper Liberal Constitutionalism, Constitutional Liberalism, and Democracy. In this video, I will refer to the government and the state interchangeably, even though some analytical frameworks consider these to be different. I will also use the terms freedom and liberty interchangeably. First, we should begin by defining individual sovereignty. Individual sovereignty can be defined as a person's control and ownership over their own self and their own life. Individual sovereignty and freedom mutually entail each other to a large degree, so at the risk of speaking less precisely, I will treat them as synonymous, meaning that I will argue that democracy promotes both freedom in a general sense and individual sovereignty as I understand it. With this noted, we can build on our understanding of individual sovereignty with John Stuart Mill's 3 domains of human liberty from his work on liberty. The first domain is the inward sphere of consciousness, the freedom of thought, feeling, and speech. The second domain is the liberty of tastes and pursuits, and shaping our life to suit our own character. The third domain is the freedom of association. It's the freedom of individuals to come together, to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others. We can further supplement our understanding of individual sovereignty by adding Viktor Vanberg's thoughts on it. He explains that the principle of individual sovereignty is that legitimacy in social matters, including the legitimacy of the rules of private law themselves, derive only and exclusively from voluntary agreement among the persons involved. From this, it follows that voluntarily accepted contracts are legitimate. The contracts themselves may impose obligations and restrict the liberties of the involved parties, but are legitimate since they are accepted voluntarily. We will call this the freedom of contract. The freedom of association and the freedom of contract can be used to justify democracy, and we can see how by using a communal living arrangement as an example. Imagine a hacker house full of energetic young software developers. They've rented out a townhouse with a lot of common space and share a good deal of their property among each other. One of them brought their TV, the other one brought their car, and another one brought a good share of the furniture. They invite you to take a room, but in order to live with them, you need to agree to live by the rules. One of the rules is that the ownership of certain kinds of personal property may be determined by voting. If, for example, they vote on it, they can take your Xbox and assign it to someone else by winning with a simple majority. You agree to this and enjoy your new communal arrangement with its respective rights and responsibilities. Now, let's apply the bike example from the meme earlier. Imagine you own a bike, but the people at the hacker house thought that one of your roommates needed it more. Imagine they put it up to a vote and take that bike from you. Is that democratic? It most certainly is. But does it violate your individual sovereignty? No, it does not. You agreed to live there under the condition that this might happen. You may have voted against the seizure of your bike, but in order to claim that the seizure of your bike is illegitimate, you have to withdraw endorsement for the freedom of contract and freedom of association, which is itself withdrawing endorsement for the notion of individual sovereignty. Now, in our toy example here, the hacker house is an arrangement based on private autonomy within a larger system of private law. But if we view human liberty as normatively basic, or as having moral value independently from the law, then it follows that we should also extend this respect for individual sovereignty to the level of constitutional choice. That is, a constitution and private law framework is valid if it is voluntarily agreed upon by the parties governed by it. This is essentially what a democratic society or polity is. Liberal philosopher John Rawls puts it neatly by saying a democracy is a cooperative venture venture for mutual advantage, and democratic citizenship is a relation of free and equal citizens who exercise ultimate political power as a collective body. This amounts to a social contract, a term I'm sure many of my viewers have heard before. We are now able to draw a clear dividing line between democracy and mob rule, also known as ochlocracy. Ochlocracy was identified as a corrupt form of democracy by the ancient Greeks. Democracy is rule by the whole people, whereas ochlocracy is rule by one faction, the mob, over the people. Democracy requires equality of political power among citizens, whereas ochlocracy does not. Ochlocracy is also characterized by a lack of respect for the rule of law and the rights of the individual. We can turn back to the hacker house example to illustrate ochlocracy in action. Imagine you live in a random apartment and your neighbors who you've never met before gather together and vote on taking your bike. This would be a paradigmatic example of ochlocracy. By contrasting ochlocracy with democracy, we see that there is a difference between the fundamental substance of democracy and the form that it takes. Vanberg and Hayek describe the basic principle of democracy as being the notion that all legitimate political power originates from the individual members of the polity. Procedures of voting and representation are merely forms of governance that are meant to be in harmony with this principle, while in practice, democracy certainly requires some kind of voting and will generally involve the majority getting what they want. These forms of governance exist separately from and can be in violation of the essential principle of democracy. It is for this reason that having a strong constitution that protects the rights of the individual is extremely important. Some things just shouldn't be up for a vote, and it is actually more democratic for them not to be. Now, it's important to note that individuals may voluntarily consent to a variety of arrangements. In the hacker house, you might have consented for your buddy Paul to be the king. So my argument so far has provided potential justification for the existence of any kind of government. It has also imagined some primordial, pre-community state of social relations that precedes the formation of the government. But in the real world, we're born into our society with the arrangements already made. How can we ensure that a currently existing government is a voluntary cooperative endeavor and not some kind of tyranny? By answering this question, we can see another strength of democracy: its legitimizing quality. If a government is justified by the freedom of association and the freedom of contract, then we can say that a government is justified if it has the consent of the governed. This idea is known as popular sovereignty and was put forward by Enlightenment philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Locke. Someone consenting to being governed and obeying the rules of the government entails them consenting to be a member of its political community and accepting a series of duties in exchange for rights. So, how do we know if popular sovereignty is being respected? What does it mean for the people to consent to being governed? After all, none of us signed a contract saying, "I consent to be governed." Well, signing a contract isn't the only way of giving consent. You can give consent verbally or even implicitly as well. You consent to being somebody's friend, but you wouldn't sign a formal declaration of friendship with corresponding rights and duties. Also, if I asked you to retrieve my keys and both of us knew that my keys were in my drawer in my house, then I would implicitly be giving you my consent to go into my house and to open my drawer, even though I never literally said so. Some argue a populace has consented because it benefits from the arrangement. While this may certainly help its case, it's not enough, since that's not how consent works. For consent to be given, the consenting party needs the ability to say no, and for consent to be vitiated, there needs to be coercion coming from some party. Coercion requires an imbalance of power favoring the coercing party, which in this case would be political power. Since democracy is all about distributing political power as evenly as possible, it follows that a community that is substantially democratic has freely chosen whatever arrangement it ends up with, since it is free from the coercive influence either externally from something like an empire or internally from something like a disproportionately powerful faction. Now, it is important for us to remember the distinction between the substance and form of democracy. Just because a government involves voting doesn't mean it's legitimate, and just because a community lacks such formalities doesn't necessarily make it undemocratic. Perhaps your buddy Paul would make a great king, and without any such law compelling him, he would rule for the benefit of the people. As a matter of moral principle, he would only exercise authority after carefully hearing out everyone's concerns and providing practicable and agreeable compromises between competing interests. So much so that the people's interests and concerns are what determine all executive action. Furthermore, imagine that he does have the consent of the people. They like him, and he promises that if they change their mind, he will abdicate the throne. I think it would be fair to describe such an arrangement as democratic, but that is not to say that the form doesn't matter. We can better safeguard the substance of democracy in the same way that we protect the rights of the individual, by codifying it into law and establishing effective political institutions. While a benevolent ruler may be scrupulous enough to avoid infringing on anyone's rights, a system of checks and balances balances, a constitution, and the separation of powers contribute to the rule of law and make certain levels of executive overreach impossible. Likewise, certain formal features of government better foster substantial democracy, namely the ability to vote. Voting could be done in blocks or individually, directly or by elected representative. Different systems may suit certain populations better. That's not to say that even voting is perfect. Arguably, voting still gives more power to people who are persuasive, even to those who use such skills deceitfully, leading to demagoguery. Additionally, a total winner-take-all system would actually be undemocratic, since the minority would have no political power. This would violate the essential principle of political equality among the citizens. Instead, proportional rule is actually more democratic than majority rule. With proportional rule, the minority receives concessions and compromises when practicable. But what about dissenters? What if somebody opts out of the system? By definition, you wouldn't have voluntary association and freedom of contract if it was compelled. People need the freedom to say no, or it isn't freedom. I agree. If somebody doesn't want to be part of the polity, they should be able to say no. But if they do, there are certain consequences that follow necessarily from the fact that they have refused the contract. Firstly, a dissenter has no right to the services provided by the government. They have no right to the aid of the police, firefighters, or any other public servant, nor do they have a right to use things such as public roads, parks, or publicly provided water. Secondly, they may be subject to any agreement of exclusion that was part of the social contract. Maybe the contract included an agreement to exclude dissenters from the polity's markets, universities, or other public institutions. Lastly, a dissenter has no right to hold property that ultimately belongs to the community. In the United States, as well as in other countries, when you own land as private property, you do not actually own it full stop. Ownership is viewed as a bundle of rights. When you own something as private property, you get certain rights from that bundle, namely the rights to use it in certain ways and to exclude other people from it. But at a more fundamental level, the state still actually owns it, which is why it has the right to reclaim the property if you don't pay taxes, and why the Constitution expressly gives the government the right of eminent domain. Ultimately, your claim to property such as land is justified by and upheld by the state, and the state may confer you those rights on the condition that you accept the corresponding duties. But wait, you interject. Surely people have natural rights independent of the state. Murdering somebody is morally wrong, regardless of whether people agree on it or not. I have a right to property, and taking that property from me is theft, whether or not the tyranny of the mob agrees to it. I agree that people have natural rights independent of the state, and I will concede for the sake of argument that people have a right to their property. It therefore follows, however, that an individual does not have a right to expropriate other people's property, because that's theft. And this includes property owned by the community. You have no right to expropriate the commons without the consent of its owners. The land, being part of the commons, is owned by the state in representation of the people. You have no right to expropriate the property for yourself without their consent, and the conferral of their consent is determined by the laws of the state. Now, you may argue that the state's claim to the land is illegitimate, and you may even be correct, but it would follow as a logical consequence that you could not use the state to justify your claim to property like most people do in practice. And why is the state's claim unjust? Did it steal the land? According to Robert Nozick's entitlement theory, which a lot of right libertarians subscribe to, this would make your claim to the property illegitimate since you are dealing with stolen goods. In the case of a US citizen, this would mean that they should return the land to the Native Americans from whom it was stolen. This is not to say that a state is required in order to have a moral right to property, but if you can't use the state and its laws as justification, you will most likely be left without any justification yourself. Maybe you subscribe to Locke's labor theory of property like many right libertarians do. The idea is that you rightfully own natural resources when you mix your labor with them. But did you homestead the land you're on and build your house or apartment building yourself? Did you get it legitimately from somebody who did? But what if they had consented to be governed? Wouldn't that give the state a claim to the land? And even then, the ability to homestead the land may have been made possible by the state claiming the territory and defending it. And wouldn't the Lockean notion give the community a right to the land since it developed the infrastructure for the land you're using? Or maybe you believe that the land belongs to everyone and is subject to fair use, which is a view I like. But that view of property is far more friendly to socialism anyway, and it would still be fair for a community to develop land for its members. There are a variety of ways to look at the problem, so going down each rabbit hole is not feasible in this video. But the main point is that no matter how you frame the issue, your claim to resources claimed by the community will look dubious if you don't accept the social contract. We can illustrate this concept more intuitively using two examples of dissenters, the forest hermit and the park squatter. Imagine a dissenter who is fed up with society. "You make me wear deodorant," he cries, "and put pants on in the morning. I'm sick of this. I opt out." Let's say, for the sake of argument, that he is able to find unowned land that is not owned by the community or anyone, if that can be said to even exist. Let's imagine a corner of the woods that is not being used for logging, it's not a hunting grounds, nor is it a public park, it's just there, and let's say that he acquires property that he has a rightful claim to. What justifies ownership of property is itself up for debate and somewhat arbitrary, but for our purposes we can say that it is something like Locke's labor theory of property. He mixes his labor with the land by cultivating herbs, and he makes tools for himself out of the wood and stone that he finds there, thereby giving him a justified claim to that property. Indeed, we have made several ideological assumptions about the nature of property here, but we can use it to make a point. Now, imagine that the community comes up to him and says, "Nice stuff you've got there. We are now taking ownership of your hut to give Craig a chance to try it out. And we demand that you give us some of your whittled sticks and dried pieces of fish as taxes. We voted on being a community, and that means our government is justified, so suck it." The dissenter gets angry, and rightfully so. In this example, the community has no right to do this. This is an example of ochlocracy, not democracy, because the dissenter opted out of the political community who is governing him. Now, on the other hand, let's take the case of the park squatter who is likewise fed up with society. "You make me wear deodorant," he cries, "and put pants on in the morning. I'm sick of this. I opt out." One day, he goes to the park, not wearing pants, and sees a nice field that people like to play ultimate frisbee on. He pulls out his farming implements and starts tilling the earth and cultivating barley. He then fences off a large portion of the field. Later on, some of the townsfolk come by to play ultimate frisbee. "Get out," he says. "This is my yard." The townsfolk are rightfully frustrated. He can use the field just as they can to play frisbee, but he can't claim it all to himself indefinitely. I think anyone would agree that the park squatter is not justified in this case. The park belongs to the community, not exclusively to him. If somebody wants to opt out of being governed, but continues to live in society and benefit from everybody's taxes, they are being far more like the park squatter than the forest hermit. But some viewers might not yet be satisfied. They may insist that just because they live in society doesn't mean they have implicitly agreed to the governance of the state. They haven't signed a contract. This may be true, but it is an argument about the proper procedure for giving consent to being governed by a state, and it is picking this procedure quite arbitrarily. Furthermore, it is not a refutation of my main argument about how a democratic government would be justified. If it made these persistent contrarians happy, we could have everybody go to the DMV when they turn 18 to sign a contract explicitly giving their consent to being governed in exchange for the right to participate in society, and nothing would change functionally speaking. I don't know who would not sign that document. A second thing to keep in mind is the important thing for my argument is not the method of how consent is given, but rather the consequences for not giving it. If you feel that you have not consented to being governed, that is all well and good, and maybe you're right. But then you would believe that you have no right to receive government services, to vote, or to hold property ultimately owned by the community. In short, if you called the police, used roads, owned a house, or rented an apartment, you would be committing an act of theft. That is the logical conclusion of saying that you haven't consented to the government. Now, there is an alternative complaint that could be raised here. Just deserting all of your property and going to the woods is not a realistic option. Most people don't have wilderness survival skills, and they could move somewhere else, but that somewhere else will also have its own social contract and rules too. Essentially, the choice we are left with is to comply with society or die. Not much of a choice, is it? And is a choice made in such coercive circumstances really consensual? This is actually a very good argument. The argument can be made more clearly by making a distinction between negative and positive liberty. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines negative liberty as the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints, and positive liberty as the possibility of acting, or the fact of acting, in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. Negative liberty can be characterized as being freedom from being harmed by someone else, and positive liberty can be described as freedom as power to act. I think this positive positive notion is quite in line with John Stuart Mill's second domain of liberty mentioned earlier. We can further clarify the difference using an example. Imagine someone who is really poor and cannot afford proper healthcare. Nobody is stopping him from going to the hospital to get what he needs, so his negative liberty is not being infringed, but he lacks the capacity or power to do so since he lacks the money. Freedom, in any meaningful sense, requires power, and it is precisely this kind of freedom that may be missing for our dissenters with respect to the social contract. Sure, you may technically be free to opt out, but if you don't have the power to meaningfully follow through with that choice, then in a real sense, you are not free to opt out. I actually agree with this critique. Unless we provide reasonable accommodation for dissenters, we can speak of dissenters not having enough power or positive liberty to opt out. But there's a catch. People who take the bait and try to use this concept to invalidate democracy as a form of government are in for an unpleasant surprise. If we value positive liberty, it becomes even easier to justify democracy and egalitarian social reform. In fact, the foremost advocates of positive freedom are left-wing thinkers, including social liberals like T.H. Green and socialists like Karl Marx.
Добро пожаловать к левым, товарищ! Присоединяйтесь к нам в борьбе против капитализма.
Зона доступного здравоохранения.
Just like how the dissenter's only choice, practically speaking, is to conform to society or die, many members of the working class are in a situation where their choice is either to work under unfavorable conditions for a capitalist or die. For many, they have the option of picking one employer over another, just as the dissenter can opt to live under one state or another. But, just as the dissenter may find each government oppressive, so too will the worker find each employer to be oppressive. Whether you like capitalism or not, capitalism can be neutrally described as a hierarchy that gives some people power over others. Libertarian socialist live streamer Vaush makes this argument using his infamous, crass, but effective Coconut Island example. And democratic socialist Ben Burgis, in his debate with right-wing libertarian Gene Epstein, argued that his stance on positive freedom was the main difference between their political ideologies. So, an endorsement of the welfare state and government regulations follow naturally from accepting positive freedom as an important political value. Going back to our example with the person who can't afford their healthcare, we could give them more positive freedom by establishing a government-run single-payer healthcare program. We could use the government to provide people with education, public infrastructure, and protection from discrimination because these things meaningfully make people more free in a positive sense. Not only can the concept of positive freedom be used to advocate for egalitarian economic reform, it is also fostered by the very structure of democracy. Democracy, by definition, gives political power to the individual, allowing them to have a say in the decisions that affect them. This, in and of itself, increases an individual's positive freedom, in addition to any advancements made as a result of such policies as those mentioned earlier. By accepting this new conception of freedom, we get a more nuanced understanding of how democracy upholds and fosters individual sovereignty. Now, whichever view of freedom you take, there is one more key way in which democracy is in harmony with individual sovereignty. Democracy is the only form of government that respects individual sovereignty in collective decision-making. It does so by giving power to every individual and making sure the government is accountable to them. Democracy is all about giving people a say in the decisions that affect them, and this augments individual sovereignty. We can illustrate this with an analogy. Imagine you and some of your friends are going swimming in the pool together on the first day of summer. When you get there, you have some decisions to make. What game should you all play together? Is Spencer invited? What kind of pizza should Rico's mom order? Is the dog allowed in the pool? How long are you going to swim for before going back to play video games at Jared's house? Should we kick Josh out if he pees in the pool? How can you make these decisions in a way that respects the sovereignty of the individuals? Maybe your friend group has a sort of informal leader who can make the decision. Stacy is the de facto leader because she has a trampoline at her house that everyone likes, so maybe she should call the shots. Rico exclaims that he should decide on what to do since it was his idea to go swimming, and Jared insists that since it's his pool, he should get to decide. None of these ways of deciding give everyone a say. In the spirit of John Stuart Mill's second domain of liberty, we should argue that for individual sovereignty to be upheld, people need to have a say in the decisions that affect them. For example, you might agree to alternate between games of colors and Marco Polo, or you make concessions and agree to play water polo as long as Stacy plays goalie, since she's just too good. It's not possible for everyone to get their way, but by giving everyone an equal say and engaging in this sort of give and take, you can get more equitable outcomes for groups with competing interests. Likewise, in real life, a polity faces decisions that affect all of its members. What kind of regulations do we impose on businesses? Do we enact tariffs? What kind of taxes do we levy? Should we go to war with East Asia? How much money should we invest in infrastructure? These decisions affect everybody in our community, and the individual sovereignty of the citizens is violated if they have no say in the decisions. The examples I've given so far relate mostly to positive freedoms, but this concern for the representation of individual sovereignty and collective decision-making is relevant to protecting negative freedoms as well. What if we are making decisions about what to do with the commons? Surely the city selling the local park to a wealthy developer without the consent of the community who owns it would constitute an act of theft, wouldn't it? This would be an aggression against each individual member of the community and would be an infringement on their negative liberties. And what about externalities? If a company were to pollute and poison the air or water supply, is this not an aggression and infringement of negative liberties? For the case of externalities, you could theoretically have an impartial third party call the shots, but because it's hard to ensure neutrality, I think it's fair to say that there should be some level of democratic representation, either in the decisions themselves or in decisions about what sorts of institutions should exist to safeguard against such offenses. At least practically speaking, there needs to be some level of accountability toward the general populace. Now, instead of democracy, there's a rival approach I see advocated for by some right-wing libertarians. They argue that the government should only be concerned with protecting basic rights, or negative freedoms, including the right to private property. By giving individual agents their own sphere of private autonomy, these larger-scale decisions can sort themselves out through voluntary actions at the individual level. This thought is expressed by the oft-repeated libertarian mantra of, if you don't like something, then just don't do it and let me do me. Do you not like it when racial minorities are refused service in restaurants? Then just don't do it yourself and let me do my thing. Do you not like it when the commons get expropriated? Then just don't do it yourself and let me do my thing. Don't like how releasing excessive carbon emissions contributes to global warming? Then just don't do it yourself and let me do my thing. Essentially, the tactic is to avoid collective decision-making and thereby bypass the problem. We can illustrate what's wrong with this by going back to the pool analogy. Carving up all of the land into spheres of private property and focusing on private ownership would be like the kids giving up on coming to an agreement on what game to play in the pool. Instead, they decide to carve up the pool into equally sized parts and give each kid their own part of the pool. If somebody wants to play Marco Polo or water polo or whatever in their part of the pool, that's okay, but you can't enter another's part of the pool without their permission. We can start to see some problems with this, beginning with the irony that the decision to carve up the pool into regions was itself a collective decision. We also see some inequities. Stacy got the part of the pool with the hot tub and Jared got the diving board. No fair. And how on earth is Rico supposed to get to his section of the pool? It's in the middle. Furthermore, their capacity for collective action is greatly hindered. Imagine they all want to play water polo except for Rico, but since Rico owns the middle part of the pool and says no, now they can't play their game. Oh, and Josh is still peeing in the pool and nobody's doing anything about that. Great. It is a point of fact that we can't avoid making collective decisions. One way or another, the political arrangements and laws we make will affect everybody in the polity, and the only way for us to make these decisions in a way that respects everybody's individual sovereignty is to have some kind of democratic process. Now, it may turn out to be better to carve up the proverbial pool in certain situations, but this can and should be done democratically in accordance with the consent of the governed. Let's make a quick recap of the argument so far. The freedom of contract, the freedom of association, and/or the concept of positive freedoms can be used to justify democratic society whose essential principles are the equality of political power, rule of law, upholding of rights, and valuing self-determination. The pursuit of these principles will bring about the formal features that we associate with democracy, namely proportional rule as opposed to merely majority rule, electoral procedures, and robust democratic and legal institutions. I am wholeheartedly in favor of democracy, but I hope that this video doesn't give you the impression that I view actually existing democracies with rose-tinted glasses. In fact, this understanding of democracy as being grounded in individual sovereignty allows us to critique modern democratic governments and denounce authoritarian overreaches, even those made in the name of the common good. It also suggests new topics of conversation and debate. There are 3 more questions worth briefly touching upon in this video. What is the appropriate size of a political community? What is the appropriate level of government interference in our lives? Are liberal democracies like America really democratic? Using the principles of democracy that we've discussed so far, we can make some general answers. In accordance with the rule of thumb that people should have a say in decisions in as much as they are affected by them, it follows that a political community should be defined by its common interests. For example, a national government uniting New York and California may be a good idea because they share common interests in national defense and in having a strong national economy. But they should have autonomy regarding decisions that only affect the respective states. In general, the principle of subsidiarity, that problems should be addressed at the most local level possible, may be a good rule of thumb. In a similar fashion, for the next question, we could say that a government should only interfere in activities that affect other members of the populace. It may be hard to draw a clear dividing line here, and once again, it may be more useful to think of things as lying on a spectrum where some things affect others more or less. That being said, I think it would be fair to argue that marijuana and psychedelics should be legal because they don't meaningfully affect anyone besides the people who use them. For the last question, I think it's best to speak of democracy as being a spectrum with some nations being more or less democratic, and wherever we decide to place America, there are some ways in which America fails to live up to its ideals. Gerrymandering, the Electoral College, and the equal number of senators for every state arbitrarily gives some citizens more political power than others. And both the first past the post and the winner-take-all methods of deciding elections favor the two-party system, resulting in very little meaningful choice for voters. Additionally, since uninformed consent is not valid, a governed public needs full transparency to give its consent. It cannot be said that a public who has been lied to by the state, corporate media, and propagandists funded by wealthy plutocrats has given its informed consent. Therefore, these problems represent real threats to the integrity of our democracy. And with that, I think we've covered our bases. Thank you to everyone who has watched this whole video. It makes my day to see that people cared enough to listen to what I think. I've listed my sources in the description, and if there was anything misleading or inaccurate in the video, please let me know, and I will put the corrections in a pinned comment in the comment section. Until next time, this has been a Nerdy Tree production.